Sipping on some tea. I'm just sipping on some tea.
Hey, what's up, my dudes? Had to come in here and make a video on this whole seat bouncing element to Supercross 4. This is probably one of the best new elements to this entire game, is this more leaning forward and backwards seat bouncing mechanic. You guys probably remember, let's just show them how to do it real quick here, Spency boy. Okay, so this track right here is the final, that's a huck, and then that's a huck. Okay, this is the final track in this game here, if you're wondering exactly which one I'm on. This one's got a couple of decent little hucks on it. But what I was going to say is you guys remember Supercross 3 was probably the first real milestone game where there was any sort of actual seat bouncing system to it at all. If you thought there was a real seat bounce system to any of those other milestone games, you were kind of just fooling yourself. You really were. Like, trust me, dude, I played them long enough. I played all these more advanced physics dirt bike games, MX Simulator, MX Bikes, Reflex, all these other games where the seat bouncing mechanic is a lot more, predominant of an actual element to affecting the physics of the bike and everything like that. So that's been one of my biggest negatives that I've had with a lot of these milestone games, especially the Supercross games, because seat bouncing is a really big element to real life Supercross. I mean, that's what separates the men from the boys. It's like, how good can you seat bounce that 3N rhythm or that quad or, whatever. That's a really big element to it. So the fact that they never really had that a lot in like Supercross 1, they certainly didn't have it in Supercross 1, might have had it like ever so slightly in Supercross 2, but that was back in those old like no inertia milestone physics days, so it probably really didn't even have much of any in Supercross 2 either. But with Supercross 3, that's when they finally started to give you a little bit of that. You could lean back and it would actually do something on the bike. It wasn't doing a crazy amount in Supercross 3, but that is definitely one element that they have advanced upon and pushed even further here with Supercross 4. There's no doubt about it, and that's what adds a lot of the skill gap to these Supercross games, because in this game it doesn't feel like you can just kind of go around a corner and as long as you're on the gas you're going to hit the jump right? Like, it doesn't feel like that in this game. It feels like you got to do more than that, than just railing a corner good and hitting the gas good. Like, it feels like there's more of an element of actually leaning forward and backwards, seat bouncing. There's more of that sort of element to this game, and it adds a whole nother type of skill gap to the game. It really does. Like, a lot of people that are just kind of in these arcade motocross games just for fun, and they don't really play them a whole lot, they don't really understand this whole leaning forward and backwards, what that adds to a Supercross game. Like, if there wasn't leaning forward and backwards seat bouncing to MX Simulator, that game wouldn't have half the skill gap that it has. If there wasn't leaning forward and backwards to like Reflex and stuff like that, it wouldn't have half this. If it didn't have the leaning forward and backwards specifically the way that is in the physics of Reflex, that game wouldn't be half of what it is. That's like half of your skill gap to your leaning on the bike. You have your leaning left and right, which, depending on how free you make that's going to add a certain level of skill gap. But then you also have your leaning forward and backwards, which has pretty much been just non-existent in these milestone games this whole time. But now with Supercross 4, you can tell they have finally started to advance upon that a little bit. And for some of you guys that haven't really been doing that in this game, because you've been really used to a lot of these other milestone games where either A, the jumps aren't even big enough to where you even have to do them, like a lot of the MXGP games, you wouldn't even have to seat bounce because the jumps aren't even peaked enough or big enough or complicated enough for you to even do that. You just close your eyes and get on the gas and you're going to hit all the jumps in those MXGP games. But with these Supercross games, like with Supercross 1 and shit, like as long as you're on the gas, like that's all you really have to do. I mean, you just got to get enough momentum in the corner. You don't really have to lean a whole lot. It's not going to affect the bike as much. Like in Supercross 1 or 2, like even if you do lean, it's just not going to affect the physics to enough of a level for it to even matter. That's the biggest thing about Supercross 4. It feels like when you are leaning, it's actually affecting the trajectory of the bike when you come off the jump face. Like when you're trying to get a little more lift to get up over a certain rhythm, and that also plays in with how they design the tracks as well. A lot of these tracks in Supercross 4, you can tell they designed them around that sort of feature where they got the jump just tall enough, the landing just tall enough, or the 3N just far enough away, or whatever, to where it almost like forces you to have to lean back on the bike on the jump face. It almost forces you to have to do a seat bouncing mechanic on the bike to be able to jump that specific bigger rhythm, right? You can see me struggling on this track right here. Of course, I'm trying to do this live, so it makes everything a little more difficult, but that 3N right there is pretty tough. This, I think this is actually a quad right here because you're kind of jumping over those two little jumps right there. But like, you got to lean on the bike in this game, forward and backwards over these jump faces, or you are not going to be able to hit these rhythms, like, period. You're just not going to be able to do it. Like, I mean, straight up. You can see right there. Okay, so you can see kind of some of these rhythms that I've been attempting to hit here. Of course, I've not been hitting them real clean. This is like my first time ever on this track right here, and I don't have a whole lot of time into this game, so you can see kind of the skill gap level of the more time you put in, the better you're going to get at this seat bouncing mechanic and being able to really, you know, there's that 3 right there that I wasn't getting beforehand. But this next lap right here, I'll show you what it does when you just don't do any leaning on the bike at all. Okay, so let me just kind of show you. So I was hitting this 3N right here, right? If I don't lean on the bike at all, it's going to do that right there every single time you come off that jump face, right? Okay, so let me hit this without leaning. You're going to land right there instead of jumping all the way over those two little whoop-looking jump things right there, right? If I don't lean any, well, shit, I kind of missed the rhythm there a little bit. I went it too far inside, but okay, this jump right here specifically, if I don't lean any, see how I'm not jumping over that tabletop? You guys saw me jumping all the way over the first tabletop there beforehand when I was leaning. Okay, so let's get around. Let's not lean. You don't really have to lean on the main triple. But this triple right here, if I don't lean, I'm not going to jump all the way into it, right? And then if you get the speed right here, if I don't lean, I'm not going to jump all the way over that triple. So pretty much all of these bigger rhythms on this track, you have to lean on the bike backwards, forward and backwards, and kind of yank the bike. You know, you got to huck the bike in this game to be able to hit these bigger rhythms. Like, there's no question about that. So that is a really badass. See right there? Now I'm getting that triple. Okay, so now I'm back to leaning on the bike, and I'll kind of show you the difference of the rhythms. Leaning there, now I'm getting that jump in. Okay, this triple in here is really difficult. There we go. Now I'm getting that, right? Look at the skill gap, though. That is so fucking badass. Look at this. Jumping over the table now on that. So if you really paid attention to the jumps I was hitting when I wasn't leaning versus what I am while I'm leaning, you can see all the difference in the world that it's making by actually seat bouncing on the bike and leaning on the bike. I mean, it just makes... Look at that. Jumping that now. Jumping that clean now. There is literally almost a section in every single one of these sections on this track in particular where leaning makes a big difference on what kind of rhythm you're going to be able to hit. So that's one of the big things that a lot of you boys that think you don't like the physics to this game, you don't really understand. You think that, you know, you think it's like really bouncy or whatever the fuck, but like you got to understand the skill gap that they have added to the leaning forward and backwards specifically, and the inertia to the leaning forward and backwards with how much it affects the bike. You got to understand how much of that has been added to this game that was not in previous Milestone games. It just wasn't. Like, Supercross 3 did not have this level of leaning forward and backwards. It just didn't. And then before Supercross 3, there was basically none at all. And if there was, it wasn't affecting the physics. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of the way the first Supercross game was. It was all just a big facade. It looked like you were doing all these things on the bike, but you really weren't. At the end of the day, it just wasn't actually affecting the physics of the bike because that game didn't have any inertia to the bike. You know, you got to have that inertia before you can even have the leaning and changing the trajectory of the physics and all that type of shit. But like, that is so badass that this game has this. Like, this is such a big element to something that makes you want to keep coming back to the game and having that separator and that skill gap. And don't get me wrong, like, you still got to get momentum out of the corner. You know, you can't just half-ass it in the corner and then lean or seat bounce and you're still going to be able to hit the jump. You can't do that. You got to get the momentum and the speed and carry the speed and seat bounce to be able to hit a bunch of these bigger 3N rhythms and stuff like that. You got to do the whole caboodle. You got to have the whole package to be able to hit it. That is so badass, dude. Like, and if you don't understand what this adds to an arcade motocross game, if you don't understand what this kind of element and feature of an arcade motocross game, if you don't understand what this adds to it, then you don't really understand arcade motocross gaming, period. Like, you just don't really understand it. Because this is massive. The skill gap to the jumping in this game is literally like 5 times more than you had in the skill gap of the jumping of MXGP 2020. Literally 5 times more skill gap to the jumping. I mean, and there ain't no doubt about it. Like, and that's so important, specifically in a Supercross game where that's like one of the biggest things that you're doing. You've got to have this level of leaning forward and backwards jumping skill gap. I just love this about this game, and this is going to add some points to my review of this game right here. This is one of the best things that they've added to this game, is more of that leaning forward and backwards mechanic to it. So either way, I just want to kind of make a video on this, just explaining to some of you guys that still don't really understand, you know, why I'm liking the physics of this Supercross 4 game. Some of you guys that think Supercross 3 was just so much better, or Supercross 1 or 2 was so much better physics. Dude, you got to understand how important an element like this right here is in a Supercross game specifically. It's so big. It's just so important, man. But I just love this. I love this element to this game. So much more replayability. It's like you're just constantly trying to get the perfect amount of momentum and the perfect amount of leaning for a certain like jump rhythm. And it allows so much more learning the track type element. You don't just feel like you can hit every rhythm on the track on the first lap. You feel like there's a level of learning the track, which is really fun. So either way, yeah, but as far as doing the seat bouncing mechanic itself, you just kind of got to play around with it, figure out kind of where you want to lean forward and lean back, or just lean back. I know there's a lot of people that just lean back when they're seat bouncing. I don't think there's a whole lot of that where you have to actually lean forward and then back in this game. You know, it's not like seat bouncing in a MX versus ATV game. It's more just like making sure you're leaning back over the jump face. You know, I feel like that does a little more possibly. If anything, just lean back with both your thumbsticks when you come up to the jump face, and it should help you a lot in these rhythms. Lean all the way back. Lean back like you're trying to do a fucking backflip over these jumps. You know, and that's how you're going to get more of that lift off up, you know, jumping up in the air trajectory. And I think that's where a lot of people are getting this idea that this game has more of a bouncy physics system to it, because for the longest time, these milestone games didn't even really have a in-air jumping, gravitational pull, seat bouncing, you know, mechanic to it. So yeah, of course, it's going to look a little more like that when they finally do start to add those sort of elements to their games. But once you get used to it, it really don't feel all that bouncy, dude. Like, once you start playing this game and you really get used to this shit, it don't feel like some bouncy house type game or anything, right? Like, I think this shit feels pretty good when you start getting in there and really playing with it. But either way, appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, dudes.